Alright, welcome back. So in this video, we're now going to talk about the term spiritual energy, right? Which is what this really whole chapter is about. I didn't feel the need to rewrite like the subheading because it's the same as what I put as the title of the chapter. So yeah, we're talking about spiritual energy. So we're going to now come up with a term or create a new formalism that makes it a little bit easier to talk about charging the subconscious to connect to God, right? So I don't have to keep saying the fourth component of quantization. We're going to basically use this term for pretty much the rest of the book. Excuse me. So in the book, I talk a little bit about, I talked about it earlier, just seemed more easy and natural to talk about in the videos a little bit earlier. But in the book, I talk about kind of how I came to think about using my subconscious to connect to God, or how I came to realize that it's a connection and not necessarily a frequency. Right, so I talked about that a little already, but maybe I'll talk about it a little bit again just because it's in the book here. So, like I said before, when I first started learning how to charge the subconscious, right, to connect to God, and I actually already knew how to do it, so I learned how to do it years ago, which was really just by chance. That was way before I came up with these ideas about the subconscious. And actually, I might as well even talk about that a little bit. That actually really ties more into what I want to talk about in the next chapter. But I'll mention it very briefly here, just to kind of get it out the way. I won't make this video too long. But like I said, I already learned how to charge the subconscious to connect to God. Well, I learned how to sort of, charge the subconscious to connect to God. I didn't think about it in that way at all back then. But it was something I figured out how to do years ago. And so basically when I was a kid, right, I didn't listen to the radio a lot, but I started getting more into listening into the radio when I was in high school. So maybe around 14 years old or so. And like most kids around that age, right, I wasn't used to, how do I want to word it? I was not used to charging my energy. Like I said, I had no idea about any of these terms back then, but just to use the terms we've set up now, right? I wasn't used to feeling emotions related to God a lot, right? So I wasn't used to increasing my connection. So I had my connection to God, so I had no idea what that was like. Really didn't experience it much, except maybe when I was a kid. But it had been so long since I had increased my connection to God enough to realize what it felt like, or have a sort of memory of what it felt like, that I didn't really, it's like I said before, I didn't really have a reference frame for what it's like to be strongly connected to God. So the negative feelings that I had, to me, was just normal, right? I didn't really question it, right? It's like a fish that doesn't know it's in water, right? To me, that was just the way it was. And I would listen to songs on the radio, was never really into dark music, always hated it, right? When I grew up, a lot of my brothers and friends and a lot of people around me, they would listen to the hip-hop music. They would listen to what I call dark hip-hop. There's a good version of hip-hop and there's a dark version. I'll probably talk a little more about that in chapter 5. But I always hated it because it made me feel so negative. Like I never knew why people liked that feeling or liked listening to stuff that just felt so dark and negative. Never understood it. And I've been like that with a lot of things, right? Like I said, maybe we'll talk more about that in chapter 5. Always been that way. Never just did things that everyone else did that I just felt was super negative. I'm like, why? Like, why wouldn't I just like things that make me feel positive and happy, right? And upbeat and, in a kind of jovial mood. Like, that never seemed uncool to me. I always liked feeling happy and being attracted to things that put me in a loving mood and things like that. Like sunny music, I'm like, yeah, that I like that, right? I don't know why people aren't interested in those things. I know why now, which we'll talk about later. Like I said, maybe in chapter 5. But still, even the music I did listen to still wasn't like, it definitely wasn't holy, but it didn't put me like in the highest mood, right? And then I remember, right, and if you're a millennial, right, so if you're around my age, you might remember this, like the first time I ever heard Christian music, I literally like the first time, never heard it before, was in it was this song from Mercy Me called "I Can Only Imagine," right? And that was the first time. Like they rarely play Christian music on the radio, right? I don't know. I don't listen to radio today, but definitely back then it was very rare. And I heard that song, and I felt so pure. It was such a good feeling because it caused me to focus on Jesus, right? And that was like the first time I ended up charging my subconscious in a way that helps me to connect to God. And I felt how good it felt. So exactly like I said, you will feel a spike in the purity, the holiness, right, of you will feel that kind of holy feeling that feels so clean and non or uncorrupted. Excuse me. And so that was like the first time I felt it. But I didn't know about the subconscious. I thought emotions were just, you feel them instantaneously and then they go away. I didn't know there's any such thing as charging. They accumulated in subconscious. Remember, I didn't know any of that when I was like, excuse me. I didn't know any of that at that age, right? So I actually didn't think much of it, even though it felt really good. I didn't like seek out more, which there's more I could say, because I did have some interesting experiences back then where I felt like God was calling me, but I didn't listen, right? Because I was still sort of internalizing a lot of these values in society, which cause us to just ignore obvious signs from God where he's calling you. And I had one back then. But, and then later, I kind of didn't focus on it that much. And then later I listened to another song, which was called Healing Begins by 10th Avenue North. And then I felt it again, right? And then, since then, I started getting a little bit more into Christian music because it felt so good, right? Like I said, you cannot get that positive feeling from anything else or from focusing on anything else except God. So whenever I would listen to music that focused on God, it would feel so nice and so wonderful. I'm like, oh, I want more of that, right? And so, long story short, later on, so many years later, this is like probably 10 years ago roughly from the time of this recording, so the age I am now, is when I went through a phase where I just kept listening to Christian music and I could feel that energy. That was one of the first times I actually started trying to live in a way where it accumulated. I didn't know it accumulated. I'll talk more about that experience later in terms of why I started doing that, and that's what led to me having a very spiritual experience, which kind of kickstarted all of this, right? So I guess that wasn't super important to what I'm talking about, but I just wanted to mention it just to say that I did understand how to charge my subconscious to connect to God from that experience. And then later, once I learned about the subconscious and I developed these ideas, I just used it to do exactly what I remember doing before. So I didn't know how to charge my subconscious to connect to God. But initially, I always thought I was charging my subconscious at a particular frequency, right? And I would always pick the universal love frequency. So I would focus on God. I'd try to feel universal love and then charge my subconscious to connect to him more. And I knew what the results were. I knew how it felt. I knew what the consequences were in terms of how it affected my behavior, which we'll talk about later. But when I was really trying to develop the theory and make it more rigorous and give it more structure, it didn't really make sense to me that it didn't quite fit what I was talking about in terms of frequency. So like I said, I mentioned this before, but just to say it again, your subconscious is always has a mixture of frequencies, right? It's always charged up at some mixture. And what I recognized is that if I charge my subconscious at the universal love frequency, I assume that's the God frequency. So anytime I focus on God, my subconscious switches to what I used to call the God frequency, then I feel his nature more as I charge up at that frequency. It didn't make sense to me to say that if I feel the inner peace frequency instead, then now I'm going away from the God frequency. It doesn't feel like it, right? So, because I know what it feels like. And it didn't feel like I was going away from that feeling very much just because I'm on this other positive frequency. And so then I thought about it. And so one day I performed the experiment. I focused on God. I was used to just charging the universal love frequency out of habit, right? But I never actually tried to charge another positive frequency. So I'm like, well, let me try that, right? So I tried to charge a feeling of peace, And it actually worked, right? I could feel more peace in a very pure and holy way while focusing on God. And so then I realized, well, it doesn't seem like it's a frequency when I focus on God, even though it seemed like that at first because I kept picking the same frequency each time. It's more like it's a connection, right? And when I focused on the idea of a connection, like I said before, all supernatural phenomena made more sense. And so ultimately, I realized that I'm connecting to God. And as I connect to God, like I said before, you experience that sort of an effect that's similar to that aphorism, a rising tide lifts all boats, right? So I can feel all positive emotions better. And then whichever emotion I specifically picked, right, to charge, I would feel that one the most. Now, so then eventually I started to think of charging my subconscious to connect to God, just like I said, in terms of a connection. But eventually, it gets a little bit clumsy in terms of terminology to constantly talking about connecting to God or to talk about the fourth component of quantization. So I wanted to set up a formalism that made things a little bit easier to talk about, which we're going to talk about now in this chapter. So to go over this point, right, says at times it may be useful. I missed the word there, but at times it may be useful to talk about subconscious energy in terms of specific energy types, right, such as emotional energy, creative energy, and even belief energy, which is kind of a weird way of saying it. But so what do I mean by that? Basically, when subconscious energy charges, right, it expresses itself in terms of its intensity or the strength of the charge, right, in different types of subconscious actions or different types of transcendental mental abilities. So it expresses itself in terms of all of them at once, but you could charge in a way that focuses on one a little bit more than the others. And so, for example, emotional energy, right, you could talk about subconscious energy in general, but you can use the term emotional energy to describe the experience of your subconscious charge, right? You can use it in many different ways, but that's just one of the ways you can use it. Or you can talk about creative energy. So if you charge your subconscious specifically to be highly creative, then you can say you have a lot of creative energy, right? Even though in that case you would also have emotional energy too, right? Like I said, you can use it many different ways, but you could still say you have creative energy. And if you charge your subconscious to have a very strong belief, like we talked about charging your subconscious to have the champion mindset, right? You would have a very strong belief. In that case, you might talk about belief energy, right? So this is just an interesting way of thinking about subconscious energy. So it's very similar to physics, right? Where in some cases, in physics, there's just kinetic energy and potential energy, right? Every form of energy is some version of that, is some variation of that. But it can become useful to talk about energy in terms of the medium in with which it's transferred to another medium, right? So the medium that's carrying the energy and transfers it somewhere else would be how we describe the kinetic energy or even the potential energy. So for example, you could talk about chemical energy, right? So chemical energy in many cases is used to talk about a type of potential energy stored within the bonds of the chemical compound or structure. Right? That's basically what chemistry studies. You could talk about electrical energy, which is a type of kinetic energy or potential energy in a battery. But you can talk about energy stored in, you could say, if it's kinetic, you could say moving electrons, right? Across a current or across a wire, right? So a current. Or you could talk about a voltage, right? So stored inside a battery in, you could say a capacitor or whatever. But yeah, you could talk about heat energy. So the energy transferred due to differences in temperature. So basically you could talk about energy in different ways, even though it's all just kinetic or potential. So you could do the same thing with subconscious energy. You could talk about in different ways in terms of which subconscious action feels like it's expressed the most in terms of your experience. So you could charge subconscious energy in a way that leans into emotional energy or creative energy or belief energy. So I feel like I'm over-explaining it again, which I have a habit of doing. So now we're going to set up a new formalism using the same kind of framework for connecting to God, right? So to go over to this point, and this is the kind of if this were like a video game, this would be like your new power-up, right? Using your subconscious, and this is going to be what the rest of the book is about, to some degree. We're now going to talk about this. So spiritual energy is a term that describes the magnitude of your connection to God, right? So in other words, I like to use the term spiritual energy, right, to talk about when your subconscious energy is charged up, specifically for the for the purpose of increasing your connection to God. Or really, you can even just, that's how you would increase spiritual energy, but specifically, we just use that term to talk about your connection to God. So it's kind of like a scalar, right? So if you're into physics or math, it's just a magnitude. We're not really talking about anything related to direction or giving it some other value to describe it. This solely talks about the intensity, right? So to me, this formalism makes it a lot easier to talk about my connection to God. So like I said, I don't have to keep saying the fourth component of quantization or increasing that connection or decreasing it. I can just now use the term spiritual energy, right? So if you have a very strong connection, let's say I charge my subconscious to connect to God like crazy, so I feel very close to God, I feel very holy, and I feel very good. We'll talk about what the experience is like later, and the sort of how it affects your behavior. But when I'm very, 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 very close to God, right, I have a lot of spiritual energy. So that's how I'm going to start using that term, right? And when feel far away from God, and I feel a lot of negative emotions, right? I feel very negative because that's what it feels like when your connection to God weakens. We'll say that you have a very low amount of spiritual energy, right? So like I said, I feel like that formalism just makes things easier to talk about. Right, in the next video, we're going to talk about how to charge spiritual energy, right? And then in chapter 5, we're going to describe states of low spiritual energy. Now, one other thing I kind of want to mention is that even your physical body, right, I believe your physical body charges your subconscious in such a way where it naturally charges a certain amount of spiritual energy. So that's actually, I think, useful to sort of recognize. Your body doesn't charge your subconscious to have huge amounts of spiritual energy. It keeps it like at a kind of normal range. So I believe generally when we think of a person that's feeling good or feeling in a certain way, relative to spiritual energy or the fourth component of quantization, right, they're usually thinking of it from the reference frame of what the body does. Because the body is always going to charge it, your subconscious, right back to a very specific state, which we call the ground state, right? So you don't feel super good in your subconscious ground state, but you don't generally feel super bad unless something's going on with your brain. It's not sort of operating the way it's supposed to, or the ideal way it should be operating. But generally, your ground state charge is going to give you a certain amount of spiritual energy. And what we're going to learn how to do is use the mind to reach transcendental levels of spiritual energy. So you can kind of say that we all have a normal amount of spiritual energy, and then we can have transcendental levels of spiritual energy, which, in theory, the transcendental levels of spiritual energy could technically be negative or positive, right? So the body's not going to go out of its way to sort of weaken your spiritual energy. You generally have a natural amount. But because we're going to talk about it later, spiritual energy is very, very sensitive. Or I should say your connection to God is very sensitive to things you do. And we're going to talk more about that when we talk about deep charging spiritual energy. So using your mind, you can weaken that connection like crazy and enter low states of spiritual energy. So that's basically happens when you engage in immoral behaviors, right? It weakens your connection to God and you lose spiritual energy. And when you engage in what we call moral behaviors, those will be behaviors that bring in or increase your spiritual energy, right? So your body gives you a normal amount of spiritual energy, but when you use the mind to charge spiritual energy or build more of it, then you reach transcendental levels of spiritual energy. And then if you just keep charging it, you could get more and more and more and more, right? And it feels wonderful. And like I said, you would behave in the likeness. You would feel compulsions to behave in the likeness of Jesus Christ, the more spiritual energy you get, right? So yeah, that's it. I just wanted to use this video to talk about a formalism. I guess I tied that story I had a little bit into this. But yeah, in the next video, we're now going to finally talk about how to actually charge spiritual energy. And then later we'll talk about what it feels like and some of the consequences and some other applications of it. But that's it for now, though. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video.